It is the 1st of May, 2026, and the golden gates of Buckingham Palace have never felt more like the bars of a civilized cage. Although the world outside still views this institution as a bastion of tradition and unshakable grace, a silent earthquake has just leveled the inner sanctum of the House of Windsor. Queen Camilla, the woman who climbed a mountain of public scrutiny to sit beside the king, has just been officially stripped of every symbol of her borrowed power. No cameras were present, no press releases were issued to the BBC. In a move of brutal, calculated silence, she was placed under house arrest, like a common criminal within the very palace walls she sought to dominate. The cause of this juryless verdict is a historic heist executed right under the nose of King Charles III. While the king was distracted by the heavy crown and the mounting health challenges of 2025, a shadow operation was draining the lifeblood of the monarchy. Camilla has been exposed as the cold-blooded mastermind who siphoned tens of millions of pounds from the Royal Treasury. This was not a mere accounting error or a minor lapse in judgment. It was a systematic looting of the sovereign grant. She quietly funneled these stolen millions into a series of mega mansions across the sun-drenched coastlines of the Caribbean, registering them in the names of her blood relatives. The one who personally tore down this filthy velvet curtain was none other than Princess Anne. For decades, Anne has lived as the silent guardian of the throne, the woman who works the hardest while demanding the least. But when the royal audit of early 2026 began to show inexplicable gaps, missing figures that reached into the tens of millions, Anne did not look to the staff. She looked toward the head of the table. The entire money laundering network, the underground transaction receipts, and the digital footprints of the Queen's personal seal were contained in a steel microfilm box seized by Anne after a relentless, months-long hunt. Faced with undeniable, ironclad evidence, King Charles was cornered. He was forced to witness, with his own eyes, the ultimate betrayal from the woman sharing his bed. The regal dinner banquet had just concluded, leaving behind the artificial glamour typical of a dying monarchy. The giant crystal chandeliers hanging along the grand hall of Buckingham Palace were still casting a blinding glare, reflecting off the gilded portraits of past kings who had fought wars to keep this wealth intact. The crowd of guests, politicians wearing industrial smiles and aristocrats draped in expensive gowns, had gradually retreated to the outer gardens. Princess Anne did not blend into that noisy crowd. She stepped back into a hidden corner right against the edge of a heavy, gold-threaded crimson velvet curtain, raising a hand to adjust the sash of metals across her chest. Her face was a mask of stone. Suddenly, the rare silence of the palace was torn apart by rushed, heavy footsteps echoing from the east corridor, a restricted area reserved strictly for high-ranking staff and the inner circle. Two men in sharp black suits appeared. Anne recognized them instantly. They were neither palace guards nor diligent butlers. They were the private henchmen of the Queen's office, men who specialized in the dark arts of reputation management and shadow finances. They weren't taking a stroll. They were backing each other against the marble wall, their demeanor a mix of panic and desperate fury. The taller one, his face flush with anger, grabbed the other's collar. He reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a quarter-folded stack of papers, and shoved it hard against the other man's chest. Every word hissed through his teeth was suppressed to the absolute maximum so as not to echo into the grand hall, yet each syllable carried a venomous threat. He interrogated the shorter man about a massive flow of money, a budget freshly siphoned from the black fund of the 2025 royal tours that had been misrouted. The original plan was to funnel that cash straight to an anonymous shell bank in Switzerland, where the law of silence would bury it forever. But a fatal error by the transit department had sent the tens of millions of pounds straight into a private trust shamelessly exposed in the Caribbean. During the struggle, the shorter man's trembling hands swatted away, trying to justify his own incompetence. The forceful push loosened the stack of documents. A thin piece of paper slipped from the fold, fluttering in the air like a dying leaf, signaling a harsh winter before falling out of sight at the base of Queen Victoria's bronze statue. Just then, the rhythmic tapping of the night patrol guards' boots echoed from the end of the hall. Terrified, the two men immediately let go of each other, yanked their suit jackets straight, and vanished into the dim walkways like sewer rats that had just caught a whiff of light. The space returned to silence, leaving only the ticking of the giant, gilded grandfather clock. Princess Anne slowly emerged from behind the velvet curtain. Her face betrayed no emotion, retaining the sharp, unwavering resolve of a statue carved centuries ago. She stepped forward and bent down. The crumpled piece of paper now rested in the palm of her snow-white gloved hand. Under the hallway's pale, flickering yellow light, every line of text and every number began to appear clearly. like daggers thrust straight into the pride of the royal house. It was an internal wire transfer receipt. The amount written on it was not a few £1,000s to pay for silk dresses or charity galas. The figure reached tens of millions of pounds. The receipt clearly stated the destination, a completely unfamiliar trust fund not listed in any official asset management portfolio of the family. And what made Anne's chest tighten was the bottom right corner of the paper. That was not the signature of the head butler or the royal accountant. It was the bright red wax seal and the razor-sharp handwritten signature bearing Queen Camilla's personal crest. The blatant proof lay right in her hand. The core of the entire corruption had been stripped bare. The enemy did not bring an army from across the channel. The enemy was living right in the heart of the kingdom, sharing a bed with the king, smiling benevolently before millions of media lenses, while secretly plunging a massive siphon into the family's back. Anne folded the receipt and shoved it deep into the pocket of her black wool coat. Her footsteps were steady, striding coldly into the night. This betrayal was too massive to be resolved with family meetings. The most ruthless hunt in the history of the monarchy had officially begun, and Anne knew she would be the one to personally tear down this filthy velvet curtain. The question remained, can this dirty truth be buried forever to protect the throne, or will the cracks of betrayal finally devastate the monarchy from within? Princess Anne stood in the center of her private study, the flickering fireplace casting long, skeletal shadows against the mahogany bookshelves. It was the deep of night on the 1st of May, 2026, but sleep was a luxury the crown could no longer afford. In her hand, the single wire transfer receipt felt as heavy as a lead weight. A lesser person would have picked up the telephone and dialed the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police or the director of the Serious Fraud Office. But Anne was a creature of the old world, a woman who understood that in the labyrinthine corridors of British power, the official channels were often the most compromised. If she handed this paper to the authorities, the machinery of the state would begin to grind, but it would not grind in her favor. Camilla had spent 20 years weaving herself into the fabric of the establishment. She had friends in Parliament, allies in the press, and high-ranking sycophants within the police who owed their promotions to the Queen's subtle influence. One phone call would trigger a silent alarm. The evidence would vanish, the witnesses would be paid to disappear, and Anne would be branded as a jealous, unstable sister-in-law trying to destabilize the throne during the king's fragile 2026 health crisis. To take down a reigning queen, Anne needed more than a suspicion. She needed a mountain of ironclad proof that could withstand the heat of a global scandal. She stepped out into the freezing London drizzle, driving herself in a dark, unmarked off-road vehicle. She avoided the main thoroughfares, cutting through side streets until she reached the outskirts of the city. Her destination was a dilapidated watchtower, a relic of a bygone era that appeared on no modern tourist map. Beneath this crumbling stone structure lay a reinforced basement, damp and smelling of old parchment and ozone. This was the headquarters of the Grey Network. The Grey Network was a clandestine cell of former intelligence detectives, seasoned forensic accountants, and retired palace retainers who had sworn a blood oath of loyalty to the late Queen Elizabeth II. They did not answer to the current government, nor did they take orders from the reigning administration of 2026. Their loyalty was to the pure bloodline of the monarchy, and they viewed Camilla as an interloper, a parasite who had breached the castle gates. As Anne descended the moss-covered stone steps, the 3 men and 2 women inside stood in unison. They did not bow, they simply waited. Anne threw the crumpled receipt onto the rusted iron table. The light from a single swinging bulb illuminated the astronomical figures and the bright red wax seal of the Queen. The lead investigator, a former MI6 operative, with eyes as cold as a Siberian winter, scanned the document. He didn't whistle or gasp. He simply looked at Anne and asked one question, "How deep do you want us to go?" Anne's voice was like breaking glass. "Trace every penny. Follow the scent of the ink until you find the throat of the beast." The hunt began in the digital shadows. Over the next several days, the Grey Network operated with a ruthless efficiency that the public police force could never match. They avoided internal palace phone networks, communicating only through physical codes and encrypted frequencies that had been out of use since the Cold War. Using professional tailing skills, they began to piece together the fragments of a terrifyingly elaborate criminal syndicate that operated under the guise of royal duty. The investigation revealed that the Queen had used the lavish foreign royal tours of 2024 and 2025 as the perfect cover for her asset-stripping operations. These trips, praised by the media as symbols of global unity and the soft power of the new reign, were actually logistics runs for stolen wealth. The budgets for these state visits, were systematically inflated by 500%. Giant briefcases of cash, protected by diplomatic immunity and never scrutinized by customs, were sneaked onto private jets under the guise of top-secret diplomatic luggage. From private airstrips in Europe, this dirty money flowed straight into the underground vaults of the most prestigious casinos in Luxembourg and Monaco. Here, the Grey Network discovered a network of professional money launderers posing as international businessmen. These individuals would take the cash money born from the sweat of British taxpayers and the centuries-old legacy of the Windsor family and wash it through high-stakes roulette tables and private baccarat rooms. By the time the money emerged, it was clean, legal, and ready to be moved into the international banking system as private gambling winnings. But the most sickening discovery, the one that struck a fatal knife into Anne's sense of honor, was the final destination of the funds. The Grey Network utilized high-altitude surveillance and hacked satellite imagery to zoom in on the sun-drenched coastlines of the Caribbean. They gathered ultra-clear photographs of magnificent mega-mansions hidden behind towering palm trees and reinforced steel gates. These were not modest holiday homes, they were fortresses of luxury, complete with private marinas, docking million-dollar yachts. When the forensic accountants cross-referenced the real estate deeds obtained through back-channel leaks, the truth was laid bare. Out of the £45 million traced so far, not a single square inch of land was registered under the British Crown or the Duchy of Lancaster. Every single estate, every brick, and every blade of grass bore the names of Camilla's siblings, her cousins, and her children from her previous marriage. It was a grand, successful migration of royal wealth executed in plain sight. While the king spoke of a slimmed-down monarchy to the struggling public of 2026, his wife was quietly building a private empire for a family that had no right to a single penny of the royal inheritance. By the end of the week, the Grey Network handed Anne a glossy black leather briefcase. Inside were hand-developed film rolls, original bank statements, with overlapping stamps from 3 different tax havens, and a list of 14 offshore shell companies linked directly to the Queen's private office. The net had been woven. It was tight, it was strong, and it was closing in. Anne knew that she now held the power to destroy a queen, but she also knew that the moment she used this evidence, the monarchy would never be the same again. The air in London felt thin, as if the city itself was holding its breath for the explosion that was about to come. Anne gripped the handle of the briefcase, her knuckles white, and prepared to deliver the first psychological strike. In the early afternoon of May 1st, 2026, a deceptive calm hung over the west wing of Buckingham Palace. This was the absolute private sanctuary of the Queen, a place where even the most senior courtiers walked on eggshells. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, perfumed with the heavy, cloying scent of expensive rose essential oil that seemed designed to mask the smell of age and secrets. Queen Camilla sat leisurely on a hand-upholstered leather sofa, the sunlight filtering through stained glass windows to catch the glare of a massive diamond ring on her finger, a symbol of the ultimate power she had fought 40 years to secure. The silence was not broken by a polite knock, but by the violent swinging of the carved oak doors. Princess Anne marched in like a cold front, her footsteps echoing with a military precision that signaled the end of diplomacy. She did not bow. She did not offer the customary "Your Majesty." She ignored the bewildered maids who scurried out of the room like frightened mice. Anne stepped directly into the Queen's personal space, her shadow falling across the porcelain tea service. Without a single word of greeting, Anne reached into her black coat and pulled out a stack of color photographs, freshly developed in the chemical darkness of the Grey Network's basement. She slammed the stack onto the tempered glass table. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. The photographs scattered, exposing the hidden world Camilla thought was buried thousands of miles away. There they were, ultra-luxurious mansions hidden behind towering palm trees in the Caribbean, satellite captures of private docks where million-dollar yachts were moored, and high-resolution scans of land deeds. Every document was a dagger. The names on the deeds were not Windsor or Hanover. They were the names of Camilla's siblings and cousins, individuals who had possessed nothing a decade ago and were now the secret owners of a real estate empire worth tens of millions of pounds. The silence in the room condensed, becoming so heavy it felt as if the walls themselves were closing in. An audience might have expected a reaction of absolute panic, perhaps a pathetic dropping to the knees or the shedding of crocodile tears to deny the crime. But Camilla was a veteran of 1,000 public battles. She paused for exactly 2 seconds. Her eyes darted over the images of the beachside villas, her pupils contracting slightly as she processed the depth of the breach. Then, she did something truly terrifying. She smirked. A brazen, profoundly arrogant sneer appeared on the face that was usually so carefully made up to look benevolent for the evening news. Camilla slowly set her gold-threaded porcelain teacup down on its saucer with a chillingly steady hand. The cold clink of the china was the only sound for a long moment. She raised her razor-sharp eyes, looking straight into Anne's piercing gaze, and instead of denying the theft, she fiercely admitted to everything. She leaned back against the leather sofa, crossing her legs with the nonchalance of a woman who believed she was untouchable. Her tone was cold and crisp, enunciating every word as if she were presenting a self-evident truth to a child. Camilla declared that the staggering sums of money reaching into the tens of millions were not a despicable act of theft. In her twisted logic, they were deserved compensation. She called them the spoils of a long, brutal war she had endured against a public that had spent decades treating her with contempt. "This monarchy is rotting," Anne, Camilla hissed, her voice dripping with a cynical venom. She argued that the institution stood on the brink of collapse under the pressures of modern democracy and the economic crises of the 2020s. She claimed she was simply being pragmatic. She had to personally hoard and scrape together every resource possible to secure a future for her own lineage. She casually stated that if the day ever came when this fragile throne crumbled, she would not allow herself or her children to be thrown onto the streets like paupers. But the audacity did not stop at a confession. Sensing that Anne was prepared to strike, Camilla tilted her chin up and launched a counterthreat that struck directly at Anne's fatal weakness, her loyalty to the institution. Camilla pointed a manicured finger at the pile of photos and dared Anne to take them to the television networks or the global newspapers. "Go ahead," Camilla sneered, her words as sharp as broken glass. She explained the cold reality of the situation. If Anne breathed a word of this to the authorities or the press, the filthy truth would dominate every front page on the planet. The prestige of King Charles, who had spent his entire life defying his mother and the public to put Camilla on that throne, would turn to ash in an instant. The king would be branded a fool or a co-conspirator. The entire 1,000-year-old institution that Anne had spent her life protecting would be dragged through the mud and torn down by the colossal wrath of the taxpayers who were already struggling in the economy of 2026. Camilla was using the very survival of the monarchy as a hostage. She was betting her entire hand on the fact that Anne would never dare to personally destroy the legacy of the late Queen Elizabeth II. She believed Anne would choose to protect the crown over punishing a criminal. It was a direct confrontation between two clashing ideologies: Anne's absolute, selfless loyalty to the bloodline versus Camilla's bottomless greed and treachery. For a moment, the two women stood in a deadlock, the guardian and the usurper. The arrogance in the room was suffocating. Camilla took another sip of her tea, convinced she had won. She believed she had built a wall of mutually assured destruction that Anne could never climb. But as Anne turned to leave without saying a word, her silence was not one of defeat. It was the silence of a hunter who had just realized that the prey was even more dangerous than anticipated, and that the coming sentence would have to be far more brutal than a simple arrest. The war for the soul of the British throne had only just begun, and the 1st of May was about to become the darkest day in the history of the palace. The moment the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind Princess Anne, the mask of regal arrogance that Queen Camilla had worn so defiantly began to crack and dissolve. The silence that returned to the tea room was not peaceful. It was suffocating. Alone in the golden light of May 1st, 2026, the Queen's hands began to tremble so violently that the porcelain saucer rattled against the table. Her eloquent defiance had been a gamble, a desperate bluff designed to stop Anne in her tracks. But as the echoes of Anne's boots faded down the corridor, Camilla realized the fatal truth. She was no longer the hunter. She was the prey. Genuine naked panic swallowed the Queen whole. She knew Anne was not like the others. The Princess Royal did not care for public opinion or the delicate balance of politics. Anne was a woman of steel who would burn the entire forest down just to catch a single wolf. Camilla understood that the pile of photos was just the beginning. If a single one of those documents reached the right hands, or if Anne found the original ledger, no amount of blackmail would save her. As night fell over the palace, the regal atmosphere was replaced by the frantic, gangster-like stench of a criminal syndicate backed into a corner. Camilla sprang into action, issuing a series of emergency orders in a voice that was no longer a whisper but a rasping command. Her underground network, a shadow cabinet of loyalists and hired fixers, began working frantically like sewer rats scrambling to escape a sinking ship. Deep in the basement of the East Wing offices, where the sun never reached and the walls were thick enough to muffle any sound, High-capacity industrial paper shredders were ordered to run at maximum power. The roar of the machinery tore through the dead of night, operating so continuously that the motors began to smoke with a sickening, burning stench. Thousands of financial documents, ledgers recording illicit bank transactions from 2024 and 2025, and sensitive internal receipts were mercilessly shoved into the jaws of the machines. They spat out meaningless ribbons of white confetti that piled high into mounds, erasing years of systematic looting in a matter of hours. The destruction extended to the digital realm. In a secluded backyard near the staff quarters, under London's freezing drizzle, burly men in black coats swung heavy sledgehammers down repeatedly. The deafening sound of shattering metal and cracking circuit boards echoed out into the fog. Dozens of computer hard drives, which held the encrypted records of every currency circulation and every shell company in Luxembourg, were pulverized beyond recovery. Camilla's henchmen ensured that no data retrieval software on Earth could ever touch the filthy numbers hidden within those silicon chips. On an even more ruthless front, a human purge was underway. At the remote housing quarters for the outer ring accounting staff, hired thugs burst in without warning. They did not use summons or offer explanations. Doors were kicked open in the middle of the night. These poor accountants, sacrificial pawns who had dirtied their hands following orders from the Queen's office, were forced to scramble their belongings together in a few short minutes. They were dragged out roughly, shoved into the back of windowless, unmarked black trucks, and escorted toward the coast. Any living witness capable of opening their mouth to confess was being forced to evaporate from the face of the earth, relocated to places where their voices would never be heard again. The climax of this frantic destruction took place at the classified record storage incinerator. Camilla herself sneaked out of her bedroom, her thick mink coat tightly wrapped around her to hide a body that was shaking from both the cold and the terror. She stood on a high stone balcony, her wide eyes staring down at the dark courtyard below. There, her most trusted henchmen were tossing large sacks containing original transaction documents and undigitized Caribbean real estate contracts into a massive brick furnace. A fire starter was thrown in, and the flames erupted violently, hungrily swallowing tens of thousands of pages of evidence. The roaring, blazing red fire lit up a corner of the night sky, reflecting in the ambitious, desperate eyes of the Queen. The acrid smell of burning paper and wax seals assaulted her nose, but to Camilla, it was the smell of safety. Every physical trace, directly connecting her to the mega mansions of the Caribbean, was turning into black ash, fluttering away into the cold night wind. When the fire finally died down, leaving only a pile of charred, desolate soot, Camilla turned and walked back into her bedroom. She poured herself a glass of hard liquor and drank it in a single, burning gulp. A satisfied smile, tinged with malice, bloomed on her lips. She was convinced she had won. She held an absolute belief that after this night, there would be no original evidence left, and no human being left standing who could testify against her. She deluded herself into thinking that Anne's pile of photos would now be nothing more than worthless scraps of paper secondary evidence that lacked the legal weight to convict a reigning queen. A late but reassured sleep finally came to her, entirely unaware that her blind confidence was paving the way for the most brutal sentence about to crash down upon her head. In her haste to burn the world, she had left one single, vital thread hanging, a thread that Princess Anne was already beginning to pull. Camilla's absolute panic during the night of burning documents ironically became her fatal loophole. When the flames licked the file shelves clean in London, the Queen had no idea she had left a massive void in her personnel system. Anne's Grey Network intelligence team, with decades of experience hunting down traitors and shadow-dwelling criminals, instantly spotted a glaring blind spot in the aftermath of the purge. When cross-referencing the list of staff members who had been thrown into the black trucks by the thugs that night, one name was entirely missing: Sir Tony. Sir Tony was no petty accountant or low-level clerk. He was the most vital right-hand man in the Queen's private office, the silent architect who held the keys to the vault for all of Camilla's black transactions. He was the mastermind who had drawn up the money-laundering blueprints through the Monaco casinos and funneled the clean cash back to the Caribbean. Tony's disappearance right before the internal purge proved he had caught the scent of death early on. He had fled, taking his only lifeline and the Queen's death warrant with him. Wasting not a single second of the 1st of May, 2026, Princess Anne decided to finish the hunt herself. She donned her signature black wool trench coat, bringing no royal bodyguards to avoid tipping off the prey. An unmarked military jet ripped through the night sky, taking off from a private runway and heading straight west. The destination was a rundown, remote suburb, shrouded in freezing fog in southern Ireland. It was a region forgotten by the world, where peeling, exposed brick houses huddled beneath gloomy gray clouds. Anne drove a hastily rented Jeep from the airport herself, pushing silently through muddy dirt roads. She stopped the car in front of a rickety inn where a rotting wooden sign creaked back and forth in the cold wind. The building reeked of stale beer and the musty stench of carpets that had never been washed. This was the final hideout of the man holding the life of the Queen of England in his trembling hands. Anne didn't bother to knock. She took a step back and delivered an earth-shattering kick with her steel-capped leather heel. The rusted padlock shattered instantly. The wooden door burst inward, slamming hard against the wall. Inside the dark, cramped room, Sir Tony was huddled under a peeling iron bed. Hearing the terrifying crash, he jumped out of his skin, his face drained of every drop of blood as he saw the tall, cold silhouette of Princess Anne, looking like a grim reaper framed in the doorway. Anne stepped into the room without saying a word. The sound of her boot heels striking the rotting wooden floor echoed in sharp, resounding beats. She dragged the treacherous man out from under the bed by his collar and threw him violently onto the floor. From her trenchcoat belt, Anne drew a razor-sharp hunting knife, a keepsake from her late father, Prince Philip. She didn't hold the knife to Tony's throat. Instead, Anne slammed the tip of the blade down into the wooden table nearby. The blade sank deep to the hilt, vibrating intensely, the cold gleam of the metal reflecting straight into the wide, panicked eyes of the fugitive. Anne's gaze held absolutely no mercy or pity. Standing on the boundary of life and death, Tony completely collapsed, his psychological defense line shattered into pieces. He crawled on all fours to the corner of the room, using his trembling fingers to pry up a chipped, loose floorboard. From the dark hole beneath, Tony pulled up a solid steel box, heavy and freezing to the touch. He offered the box with both hands up to Anne, his voice a broken whisper of a man who knew he was already dead to the Queen. That steel box was the fatal weapon, the heart of the entire criminal network. Inside that impenetrable shell was a roll of microfilm storing all the original files that hadn't been burned, and most importantly, a hard-bound red leather ledger. That ledger contained detailed notes of every siphoned fund from 2024 and 2025, and attached to every page were fresh bank statements signed in the familiar, sharp blue ink by the hand of Queen Camilla herself. The ultimate evidence, a tangible object carrying the power to destroy an entire monarchy, was finally securely in the hands of the Princess Royal. Returning to London with the fateful steel box in hand, Anne did not go back to her private quarters to rest. The fury in her veins did not allow her to wait another second. This war had to be ended today. She marched down the red-carpeted hallway, leading to the most powerful area of the kingdom, King Charles's private office. The atmosphere here was quiet and imposing, the massive oak doors shut tight against the world. Inside, Camilla was sitting next to her husband, attentively pouring him a cup of Earl Grey tea, smiling gently, and perfectly playing the role of the devoted, innocent queen. She was certain that the ashes of the previous night had forever buried all her sins. The doors burst open without a single warning knock. Anne walked in like a blizzard. Following closely behind her were 4 towering, fully armed royal guards who immediately fanned out, securing all exits and locking down the office. The air in the room instantly froze. The smile on Camilla's lips turned to ice. Anne strode straight to King Charles's mahogany desk and slammed the solid steel box right in the middle of it. The metal colliding with the wood created a deafening crack that shook the whole room. The lid was popped open. Anne reached in, pulling out the red ledger and the photos developed from the microfilm, scattering them over the king's open state documents. Everything lay naked under the chandelier light. Every dirty transaction, every figure of tens of millions of pounds gutted from the treasury, and every photograph of the secluded Caribbean megamansions. And finally, the fresh, glaring signatures of the Queen herself, confirming the dispersal of the assets. Camilla's face turned deathly pale. The silver spoon in her hand dropped with a clatter onto the rug. The naked, cruel truth lay exposed before the king. Charles was stunned, his wrinkled hands trembling as he turned each page, his eyes blurring from the shock of this fatal betrayal. The woman he had spent half his life protecting was now revealed as the giant leech sucking his family's lifeblood dry. The silence in the king's office on this 1st of May, 2026, was heavier than the stones of the palace itself. King Charles III sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the red ledger that lay open like a bleeding wound on his mahogany desk. Every page he turned was a new layer of agony. He saw the signatures he had cherished, the sharp blue ink of the woman he had loved for over 50 years, now serving as the definitive proof of a cold-blooded heist. Tens of millions of pounds, Money meant for the service of the realm had been diverted to line the pockets of a parasitic lineage. Camilla stood frozen, the silver spoon she had dropped still lying on the wool rug as a symbol of her shattered status. For a few agonizing minutes, the only sound was the king's ragged breathing and the distant chime of a grandfather clock striking the hour. The 4 towering royal guards stood like statues of ice, their presence ensuring that the queen had no path of escape. At the ultimate climax of the conflict, when any spectator would have expected a loud arrest or a frantic call to the Metropolitan Police, the most ruthless plot twist of the British ruling class began to unfold. Charles slowly stood up. His face was a map of exhaustion, contorted by the clashing forces of a husband's heartbreak and a monarch's duty. He looked at Camilla, who was now trembling like a dry leaf in a winter gale, and then he turned his gaze to Princess Anne. His voice, when it finally came, was thin and broken, yet it carried the absolute authority of a 1,000-year-old throne. "Not a word of this is to be leaked," he commanded. "No police will step foot in this palace. No trial will be held in the light of day." Anne's eyes narrowed, but she understood the cold-blooded logic. To hand Camilla over to the authorities would be to invite a hurricane of public outrage that would blow the roof off Buckingham Palace. In the fragile political climate of 2026, a scandal of this magnitude, a queen stealing £45 million, would be the final nail in the coffin of the monarchy. To save the crown, Charles had made the ruthless decision to bury the justice for the sake of the institution. However, silence did not mean forgiveness. The sentence executed within those 4 walls was more terrifying than any prison cell. At a cold nod from the king, the guards moved in. Camilla screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror, as she was roughly pinned into a chair. With no deference left for a reigning queen, the guards began to strip her of every symbol of wealth and power. The diamond-studded necklace was yanked from her neck, the clasp snapping with a sharp metallic crack. Rings set with million-pound gemstones were forcefully pulled from her fingers. They confiscated her highly secured personal telephone, the master keys to the royal safes, and the VIP bank cards that linked her to the offshore accounts. Charles turned his back to her, staring out at the grey London sky, and issued a razor-sharp ban forbidding her from ever uttering another word to justify herself. In the dead of night, without a single press release or a flicker of camera light, Camilla was dragged away. She was not taken to a dungeon, but to an isolated sector in the oldest, gloomiest wing of the palace, a suite of rooms once used centuries ago to house royals who had committed the most shameful sins. The iron-bound oak doors were locked from the outside with massive padlocks and chains. 4 guards were ordered to stand watch 24/7. Camilla was cut off from all forms of communication, no internet, no television, and a total prohibition on contacting her siblings or children. She officially transformed into a living ghost. To the public, she would remain a queen, forced to wear royal gowns and plaster on a stiff, artificial smile during mandatory ceremonies under the hidden gaze of snipers. But once the palace doors closed, she would return to her status as a prisoner, trapped within the very fake luxury she had sacrificed her soul to obtain. While the queen withered in her gilded cage, Anne's iron-fisted recovery operation began in the shadows. Under the cover of the 2026 spring storms, elite agents from the Grey Network flew to the Caribbean. They did not carry warrants, they carried files of evidence and a cold, lethal resolve. Using the most ferocious underground intimidation tactics, they cornered Camilla's relatives in their beachside fortresses. With guns held just out of sight and documents laid on marble tables, the relatives were forced to sign over every deed and every title. The mega mansions, the private islands, and the laundered bank accounts were confiscated in a matter of 72 hours. The stolen tens of millions of pounds flowed silently back into the Royal Treasury as if they had never left. The parasitic family was crushed, thrown back into the destitution they had come from, terrified into a permanent silence. The final frame of this tale did not conclude with a celebration. The camera of history pulls back to capture the solitary figure of Princess Anne. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, gazing out of a high palace window as the London rain battered the glass. The droplets looked like never-ending tears for a dynasty that had lost its heart. Greed had been punished. The thief had been neutralized. The assets had been recovered. Yet the victory tasted like ash. Justice had been bent and distorted to protect the prestige of a throne that felt increasingly hollow. The horrifying truth that betrayal had reigned in the king's own bed was buried forever beneath the cold, historic stones of the palace. The monarchy still stood tall on this 1st of May, but it survived in the most ruthless and silent way possible. The cracks in the foundation had been plastered over, but the structural integrity was gone. As Anne watched the rain, she knew that while the institution had been saved, the soul of the crown had been sacrificed to the shadows. Everything was over, yet the deep chasm of betrayal would never truly heal. The silent hunt was done, but the silence that followed was the loudest sound of all.